Okay, well, as you can imagine, the entry of these two colossal countries, or rather, the entry of one colossal country, the United States, into the First World War, and the discombobulation of another, Russia, rather destabilized the global political situation in rather dramatic and sometimes unexpected ways. Not simply the war, I talked about that already. The melting away of the Russian armies allows the Germans and then eventually Turkey to sort of have their way on the Eastern Front. But in some ways, more interestingly than that, were the political consequences. Now, oddly enough, in the early stages, everything seemed hunky-dory for the Entente powers. Because, first of all, the Americans, it wasn't just that they were worried about pro-German opinion in the Midwest and the general reluctance of a lot of people to fight in the war. There was also the fact that Americans, and we'll keep coming back to this again and again this term, have a certain particular, almost squeamishness about foreign policy. I mean, you've seen it obviously in the headlines in the last 10 days with the demonstrations in Egypt. The policies stated by Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. There's nothing new about them. I suppose the only new thing in recent years is that Bush and the Republicans took up what had been a big Democratic Party theme, which goes back to Wilson. This idea of peace between democracies, that we should promote democracy abroad and this will eventually lead countries to be more peaceful. I've never really bought that theory myself. But a lot of Americans do believe in that. And so they believe, that is, that wars should be fought for that end. Now, until 1917, you could have made an argument that, say, Germany was the autocratic country, because although they had a Reichstag parliament, it was kind of powerless. The Kaiser and then the military were sort of like an autocratic government. And you could have made the argument that Britain and France were more, quote-unquote, democratic. Yes, they both had parliaments. In the British case, the parliament was important. The power of the monarchy in Britain was limited. France was a republic. So you could say, well, it made sense for America to join the quote-unquote constitutional Republican side. But then you had Russia. Russia, a democracy? Under the Tsar? No, sirree. Russia was, of course, a symbol of autocracy. The autocratic, almost unlimited power of the Tsar. Now, true, since 1905, they had had this Duma, this parliament, which during the war was very fractious and loud in its criticism of the government. But as everyone knew, the Duma had no real power. In fact, that was one of the real problems in Russia, as we will see, that the elites, the politicians, there wasn't a whole lot for them to do. And that's one of the reasons so many of them were radicalized and were then unable to stabilize the situation in 1917. They had no experience of government. The Tsar and his ministers had ruled everything, the bureaucracy. It was kind of a combination between, the autocratic divine right rule of the Tsar and the tyrannical rule of the great Tsarist bureaucracy. There was no democracy at all. I mean, oddly enough, in 1917, Russia did kind of get democracy for a while. It got a free press that lasted about 7 or 8 months until the Bolsheviks took power. In fact, one of my favorite kind of little sidelights of the Russian Revolution is that Kerensky, who emerges as, if not the dictator, certainly the most important figure among the February revolutionaries. He'll have a role both in the worker Soviets. Again, I'll talk about all of this in detail next week. We're just looking at foreign affairs this week. Kerensky, he plays a role in the parliament, the provisional committee of the parliament. He plays a role in the kind of revolutionary workers Soviets. He also then takes on a role with the army. He emerges as the most powerful figure in Russian politics. But a little bit like, I suppose this would be the argument people have been calling Mohammed el-Baradei in Egypt. Will he be the Kerensky of the Egyptian revolution? That is, will he be the sort of liberal, democratic, acceptable face who will emerge and replace Mubarak, conceivably that is, only later on to be, of course, swept out of power by those more radical and ruthless than he. That's the phrase that I've heard in the media. It happened, obviously, to Kerensky. He's pushed out of the way. He not only loses, but like a lot of kind of political refugees, he ended up in America. at Stanford University, teaching a class on the Russian Revolution, I kid you not, in the 1960s. So Kerensky tries to stabilize the situation. And initially, it seems promising. The Americans, after all, are happy, right? They like democracies. Russia's now a democracy, kind of. You know, they've got big demonstrations in the streets, just like in Egypt. America likes that. It means people power. So the Americans were very happy. Wilson was very happy. It made his argument easier to make. It helped persuade the American public that, as Wilson put it, they were fighting a war to make the world safe for democracy. That is, America was not fighting to conquer land. America did not want to carve up the Middle East. America was fighting to make the world safe for democracy. Now, that might sound to us today like a bunch of humbug. A lot of people of a kind of conspiratorial bent, when they look at the history of the Middle East, they say, well, look at all of the oil there, so the West must have had designs on the oil. Where there's an interesting fact I'm going to throw at you. In 1914, amount of oil produced in Saudi Arabia. Anyone have an idea? 1914? Well, 0. There wasn't any. Hadn't been discovered yet. Amount of oil produced in Iraq, that is Mesopotamia. Again, 0. It's not that it hadn't been discovered. People knew that there were deposits, but they hadn't been brought into production yet. Persia was a slightly different story. You've probably heard of BP, recently in the news because of the spill in the Gulf of Mexico. BP, British Petroleum, was originally based on their oil concession in Persia. And they did produce some oil in Persia. But I'm not going to give you a figure, but I'm going to ask you, in relation to production in the United States at the time, you think there was about as much oil produced in Persia as in America? Less? More? What would we guess? About the same? More in Persia? The U.S. produced 143 times as much oil as Persia did in 1914. The two leading oil producers in 1914 were actually Russia and the United States. Russia because of the deposits in Baku, but even Russia was dwarfed by the United States. The U.S. was the world's leading oil producer until 1970, essentially when U.S. production peaked and finally started to decline. So oil was not a factor. It was definitely not a factor in American thinking at the time. To some extent, it had factored into British thinking, because the British Navy had gone over to oil. This was actually Winston Churchill's own leadership. So the British were definitely thinking about oil. But they were still thinking mostly about Persia and possibly Mesopotamia. Nobody had discovered oil in what is now Saudi Arabia yet. So the Americans, again, they're looking at the world, at least Wilson is, in a kind of abstract, idealistic way. He and the Americans, they didn't think the First World War was really about very much. They thought it was stupid. Why are these European countries committing suicide? Why are they all killing each other? It's all part of like this wicked old way of doing business in the old days. You know, cynical old world diplomacy. When the Americans learned about the secret agreement to carve up the Middle East, usually called Sykes-Picot, although, of course, Sazonov, the Russian foreign minister, was, I think, in fact, even more important than Sykes and Picot. This is another one of those things people have forgotten about. The Russian side of Sykes-Picot has been essentially consigned to the memory bin, mostly because of the Russian Revolution of 1917. So when the Americans learned about this, the Allies had to share it with them once they became an associated power. They were horrified. This is terrible. These kind of secret, backroom agreements to carve up other people's territories. It was all completely contrary to the American notion of, again, foreign affairs. The American notion, the key principles, again, you have freedom of the seas, you have kind of transparency, and then you just have this idea about democracy, which, again, can be interpreted in various ways. But the idea is that people should rule themselves. Translated into more direct foreign policy terms, the phrase which you would begin to hear, which came out in Wilson's 14 points, was self-determination. That is, that peoples must be left free to determine their own destinies. That is, people should govern themselves democratically by popular legitimacy. Well, they didn't come out with all of this at first. I mean, when Wilson first talked about why America was going to war, again, he said it was because of the violation of human rights with the sinking of the warships. It was because of the kind of autocracy and brutality of the German regime. But remember, he had no quarrel with the German people. America also did not first declare war on Austria-Hungary, Germany's principal ally in Europe, nor on the Ottoman Empire. America had no quarrel with the Ottoman Empire, as Wilson saw it. In fact, America's interests in the Ottoman Empire were not economic at all. As I've said, America had no oil interests in the Middle East. How would it? It was the world's leading oil producer. It was an oil exporter at the time. The only interests America had were essentially a couple of missionary colleges. You know, Robert College today primarily is Boğaziçi. The one in Beirut, which is now called the American University in Beirut, was then called the Syrian Protestant College. That was it, pretty much. America did not trade much with the Middle East. America had a couple of missionary colleges and a bunch of college students. Now, this was kind of a substantial thing in the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't, that big, but these were, the first pseudo-modern universities and institutions of higher learning. I mean, in some ways, of course, the forerunner of ODTÜ and eventually Bilkent, that is Boğaziçi. So America had an interest in its own academics, basically, people like me, who were here teaching. And they didn't want them to get, well, hurt. So they thought, if anything, look, we definitely don't want to go to war with Turkey because that might threaten the lives of our personnel, and it would sort of undercut the purpose of what we're doing there. And so America decided not to declare war on the Ottoman Empire. So what is America going to war for exactly? Well, again, you heard a lot about this democracy phrase. That was mostly in 1917. It's a little vague. War to make the world safe for democracy, war without annexations, that is, we don't want to conquer territory. It's all a little bit problematic, though, if you actually look at the agreements between America's allies. Remember, America was aloof. America was associated with them, but not an ally. America then discovered about these secret treaties, carving up the Middle East. Now, the basic essence of Sykes-Picot-Sazonov was this. Now, the British got, as we know, a kind of sphere of influence, including most of what is now Saudi Arabia, although they weren't going to rule it directly. Also, much of what is now, of course, well, then called the Palestinian Mandate, which includes the modern state of Israel, part of Jordan, Transjordan as it was then called. The French were supposed to get basically Syria and Lebanon. The French then also got part of the Ottoman Empire, part of modern Turkey, which is called Cilicia or Kilikia, the area down near the ominous Taurus Mountains, kind of near Adana, including also the Hatay. And then the Russians got most of eastern Anatolia, north of sort of like the Taurus Mountains, Bitlis and Van. It was a tripartite agreement, that is, to carve up the Ottoman Empire. The Russians also got, if we remember, Constantinople, that is Istanbul, including specific zones which were also divided up between Britain, France, and Russia. Russia also got most of the Bosporus littoral, including also Sea of Marmara down to Çanakkale, that is the lands abutting them. This was according to the secret agreement. So America is proclaiming war without annexations. We will not covet others' territory. America's allies are planning to carve up the entire Ottoman Empire. Not only the Ottoman Empire, of course, they also have various designs on other territories in Europe. The British expect they will probably inherit Germany's colonies in Africa. The French are going to get something to compensate them. But so this is the very opposite of a war without annexations. So the Americans are kind of beset with this dilemma. Now, how can we practice our rhetoric, our policy, when our allies are so obviously devoted to these other principles? Well, America did have some leverage. It wasn't just that America was sending this huge army to Europe. America also had become essentially the financier of the war. The center of essentially world capitalism, which is to say credit and the bond market, had been London, as we know, up to 1914. It basically transferred to New York after the First World War, more or less because the British, while not broke, had gone in hock to the Americans. America emerges from the First World War as the largest creditor. America was also selling weapons. Now, this had not been, again, exclusively designed to sell only to one side or the other. It's just that America was not able to trade with Germany because of the blockade. So America had also emerged as the primary supplier of foreign weaponry to Britain and France. So America had some leverage. That is, they had the ability to try to tweak and change these policies. And I think Wilson was intending to do this. I know that he was, because he tried, largely failed at the Treaty of Versailles, to do so. But another monkey was thrown into the works, a monkey wrench, basically, thrown into the works with the October Revolution of 1917. Because these treaties, what the Allies had promised each other regarding Turkey and so on, these treaties had all been cooked up in secret, as we know. I mean, after all, they're hardly going to announce to the world, we have this secret agreement to partition the Ottoman Empire. Have any of you seen Lawrence of Arabia, the movie? Yeah, well, there's a great scene when Lawrence pretends like he doesn't know about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which, of course, is rubbish. Lawrence, of course, knew all about it. But it's great because he pretends to be ignorant. And Claude Rains, that great actor, he also had all the best lines in Casablanca. He's the one who always says, round up the usual suspects. Well, he then says, to explain the Sykes-Picot Agreement, he says, well, Sir Mark Sykes is a British civil servant. And Picot is a French civil servant, Georges Picot. And they have agreed between themselves to carve up the Ottoman Empire. And he just kind of says it with a smile, revealing to Lawrence the secret. Well, it's definitely not true that it was a secret to Lawrence, but it was a secret to the outside world. There were only a kind of limited number of policy members who knew about these treaties, as you would expect, because if the news got out, Allied war propaganda would not be helped. It would not look good for the Allied cause if everyone knew about all of this secret dealing. The Balfour Declaration, of course, is public, but actually there is a difference. The reason the Balfour Declaration, that is this promise that the British Empire makes to facilitate, again, the settlement of Jews in Palestine with a vision eventually to the creation of an Arab state, although of course they did also promise in the Balfour Declaration to respect the rights of the local communities. People have argued ever since about how sincere the one or the other was. The reason the Balfour Declaration was made public was because Britain was trying essentially to influence world Jewish opinion. Strange as that sounds to us today. What they thought they were doing, basically they saw Zionism, as I talked about in the first half of the lecture, as a kind of German thing. It was like a tool of the Germans and the Austrians, which they thought allowed them to influence events in Russia. After all, many of the revolutionaries in Russia were Jewish, and Russia was kind of like hanging in the balance. The army has begun to fall apart, and by the end of 1917 it has done so. But until the Bolsheviks took power, it wasn't entirely clear that it was going to completely fall apart. And so Britain thought, look, if we take over Zionism, if we say like it is now a British-supported thing, then all of those Jews in Russia will support the cause, and they'll keep Russia in the war. And then meanwhile, of course, there's a huge Jewish population in America, particularly in New York, and if we get them excited about the war, then the Americans will maybe mobilize more quickly and devote themselves more fully to the Allied cause. You remember that both America and Russia, after the Russian Revolution, the Russians are kind of in the war and they're kind of out of it. The Americans have declared war, but only on Germany, not on Austria-Hungary, not on the Ottomans. So the British basically think in this abstract kind of geopolitical sense that they're going to take Jews in the world who don't really support one side or the other, and they're going to make them all support the Entente side, so that Russia and America will be invigorated into supporting the cause. That was kind of a crazy idea in a lot of ways. The timing of it, though, was actually very much an accident. They had been thinking about it for a while. Basically what happened was a German newspaper, the Vossische Zeitung, ran a kind of pro-Zionist editorial, and so the British thought, oh no, the Germans are about to take over Zionism. And they said, we better act. And so they issued this declaration. So the difference between these two things, this one is public. This is very much a secret. They are making promises to various groups in the Middle East, but they're promises of different kinds. The promises to the Arabs were not necessarily more or less sincere, but they were secret. You know, they made these promises to the Hashemites, that is, particularly Hussein of Mecca and his sons, who eventually take over the thrones of Iraq and Transjordan. That's all done in secret, though. Nobody is supposed to know about that. The Balfour Declaration, it's sort of more abstract, and it's looking at this long-term future. But here's the thing. This did not remain secret for long. And the reason for this was because of the October Revolution. Now, what happens basically, we now know the details of it. The October Revolution, unlike the February one in Russia, was not at all popular. That is, it wasn't like a great large demonstration in the streets. In fact, oddly enough, there were no casualties. The February Revolution, there were a lot of people who were injured and killed. The October Revolution, there were like 5 people injured. And I think they all were injured in cleaning their own weapons. Basically, what had happened by this point, there are a lot of versions of the story, and I'll give you the domestic side of it next week. But essentially, Petrograd had been left more or less defenseless. The government had begun to disintegrate. The Bolsheviks just fanned out across the city. They took all the key choke points. It was very much a classic coup d'etat. They took over the Winter Palace. That's where there were the 5 casualties, now the Hermitage. And you can go, has anyone been to Petersburg? No, it's fun. You can actually go up into the Hermitage, the art museum, and they have the clock. And what the Bolsheviks did when they seized power is like they literally stopped the clock. 2 a.m., you know, as our calendar would have it, you know, the 8th of November, 1917, the Bolsheviks they took power, you know, year 0. Everything starts anew, just like in France. Well, one of the very first things they did, Trotsky, who by this point has thrown in his lot with Lenin, Trotsky goes to the foreign ministry, and he announces, "I am your new foreign minister." And everyone just kind of laughs. It's like this goofy guy with the goatee, you know, you're our foreign minister, you don't know anything. Trotsky had the last laugh, though. He had the last laugh because he got some of his kind of aides and adjutants to rifle through the archives and the correspondence, and he discovered this. He discovered this along with all of the other secret treaties between the Allies about their plans for the post-war world. And he leaked it to a reporter from the Manchester Guardian, the sort of ancestor, the predecessor of today's Guardian newspaper, which is, of course, still quite famous in England. And they published them. Oh, was this a scandal. The Allied secret dealings, all of their kind of like maneuvers and promises to each other are suddenly exposed to the world's eyes. It doesn't look good. Now, it's not just that it doesn't look good for the British or the French. It also, in a way, pisses off the Americans. Because if you think about this, look, America has entered the war, but not yet really, right? I mean, they're just starting to mobilize their army. Mostly they're talking, right? Wilson is talking about democracy. We're going to fight a war to make the world safe for democracy, and this is our cause, and we can all believe in it, blah, 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 blah. Now, the Bolsheviks seize power, and they expose the utter hypocrisy of the Allied side. And then they also basically say, we want peace, full stop. You know, Wilson has said he wants to end the war without annexations, and the Bolsheviks are saying, we're just going to end the war, just like that. Now, according to the theory of international socialism, this should have happened automatically once the workers all realize, you know, they're true brothers with other workers, they'll all lay down their weapons. In practice, though, what the Bolsheviks are doing is they are now sending propaganda to the front lines, telling the soldiers to put down their weapons. And as the phrase has it, fraternize with the enemy. That is like, you know, go over and talk to them, you know, kick a football around, hang out, you know, share a smoke. Don't fight. You know, the other side is not your real enemy. Your real enemy are the ruling classes. Now, it's interesting, and something that would be very difficult to prove, but an interesting argument. The Germans financed Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and they paid for all of this propaganda. Some of it, though, seeped back into Germany, where eventually, as we're going to see, it undercut Germany's own war effort. But for the time being, it was mostly happening on the Russian side of the lines. So the Bolsheviks, in a way, it's like they've sort of like raised the stakes. You know, the Americans put all these cards on the table, you know, and they said, look, we're going to bet $100, make the world safe for democracy. And then the Bolsheviks come in with like this huge pile of chips and say, no, we're going to create a whole new world where no one's ever going to fight because we're all going to be brothers. Again, blah, 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 blah. You can believe the propaganda or not, But it's pretty dramatic, sexy propaganda, backed up now by the fact that, again, they've exposed the hypocrisy of the secret treaties. So now Wilson's kind of thinking, this isn't fair. I mean, think about it now from the American perspective. America has been a democratic republic for, by this point, 130, 140 years. Now, it's true, the franchise was initially limited, they had slavery, but then they fought a civil war, they freed the slaves. America sees itself as like the shining light, the city on a hill, because it has 140 years of experience in self-governance. The Constitution says the power resides in the people, the people's representatives. It all depends on the people. They think of themselves, that is, as sort of like the progenitors of modern democracy. And now these upstart bohemians, basically, like these Bolsheviks, a bunch of gangsters, basically, as eventually the world will discover. I mean, they really were gangsters. I mean, they literally like robbed banks. I mean, that's what they did. They just show up and they say, well, forget about this stupid American democracy. We're going to offer you communism. We're going to end all wars, everywhere, immediately. All you have to do is listen to us and just lay down your arms and surrender and, sing Kumbaya, and the world will all have peace, democracy, blah, blah, blah. So Wilson gets really angry. Like, they're stealing my thunder. They're stealing my message. This isn't fair. And so he comes up with his own message. And it's like this, diplomatic one-upsmanship between the Americans and the Russians, which, in a way, you can begin to see the outlines of what will eventually become the Cold War, even though that's like decades later. This sort of ideological battle, that is, between Western democracy and communism. It's born right there in the fires of war in 1918. Now, Wilson's 14 points, again, just to kind of summarize them. If you want to look at all 18, look it up on Wikipedia, really, it's all there. I'll just give you the essence of it here. Okay, you have war without annexations, as I said. That is, we will not annex territory. We don't want anyone else to annex territory. We have a self-determination. That is, groups are supposed to determine their own rulers and leaders. That you're not supposed to have horse trading and, the carving up of empires. Peoples, whether Arabs, or Jews, or Armenians, or Greeks, or Turks, they're not supposed to be like bartered around. They're supposed to determine their own destiny. So you have self-determination for the peoples, peace without annexation. Wilson hadn't really thought all of this through, because if you think about it, self-determination of peoples, peace without annexation, no carving up of empires. Well, how can the peoples of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Ottoman Empire have self-determination unless you carved up those empires into pieces, right? In fact, Article 12, among these articles, did specifically point to self-determination of the minority groups of the Ottoman Empire. A country with which America was not at war. So Wilson, in a way, was kind of hoist by his own petard. Not everyone noticed this at first. It took a long time until the kind of horse trading at Versailles had made clear just how many contradictions there were in these ideas. But this was probably the most glaring of them. The notion that the U.S. is not actually fighting a war with Turkey, and yet the U.S. wants self-determination for the minority groups of the Ottoman Empire. We should remember, I talk about the missionary colleges. This missionary impulse is important. It's always present in American foreign policy to one degree or another. Wilson himself was a devout Christian. In fact, by profession, he was a theologian, or in fact, a professor of theology. He was an academic. He later became, in fact, president of Princeton University before he became president. So he was both an academic, sort of like egghead, you might say, an intellectual. He was also a theologian and a devout Christian. So that his own impulse in foreign policy was kind of close to that of these missionaries. Now, we remember, of course, that the missionary colleges, they're not just teaching Christianity. They're also teaching things like modern science and literature, and they're teaching English and so on. That said, the motivating force behind them, which was shared by other missionaries who were literally just trying to convert Christians, because that's what missionaries do. A lot of these groups, of course, had close ties to the Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Not only the Armenians and the Greeks, but other groups like the Assyrians and the Nestorians and the so-called Syriac Christians. So that there were a lot of Americans who really didn't like sort of the Ottoman Empire that is sought as the oppressor of these minorities. Of course, many of them had sent in reports from the field about atrocities committed against Armenians, so that, as there is today, there was a large kind of Armenian lobby in America. And Wilson, it's not that he was that close to these people, but he knew some of them. There was definitely an impulse behind his policy, which pointed towards the kind of embrace of minority rights and self-determination in the Ottoman Empire. This is why Article 12 specified that. On the other hand, America was not at war with Turkey, right? So you have one country with all these ideals opposing this, right, opposing the carving up along kind of imperialist lines, but maybe kind of looking towards self-determination for these peoples, while on the other hand, not being willing to actually fight Turkey. You had a recipe, that is, for confusion and possibly disaster, which was made even worse, of course, by the fact that these points were infinitely supple. They depended a lot on who was doing the asking. Like, take, for example, the idea of a peace without annexations. Now, who would that appeal to in a war? The side that was winning or the side that was losing? That is, no peace will allow another country to grab territory from another country. Well, the winning one would want annexations, right? So the losing side is going to want a peace without annexations, right? Now, the Germans, remember, for the most part, are winning right now, right? They're basically conquering Eastern Europe and Russia. They're still only about 50 miles from Paris. So initially, they don't really like Wilson's ideas very much. Yeah?
What about foreign access to the sea and the modification of Italian frontier? I think there was difficult to reconcile with self-determination of Wilson.
You're talking about Italian aims in the war?
No. Wilson's self-determinations follow that he said that foreign access to the sea and modification of Italian frontiers.
Italian?
Yeah, Italy.
Yeah, but I'm not sure what you're talking about with Italy's. You're talking about Italy's aims to conquer territory from Austria, or are you talking about trade?
Wilson's flow. He talked about self-determination.
Right.
So, like, he made like 14 points, obligatory, and like 6.
Yeah, they were not obligatory exactly. They were more like a blueprint for what he hoped the post-war treaty would look like. Eventually, he changed a lot of them. Eventually, he was forced to compromise. Again, it was propaganda. It was kind of like a response to Lenin. It was kind of saying, like, look, we can do this just like you. We can draw up a plan. But you're right. Italy, like all of the other powers, I haven't talked that much about Italy. Italy had its own designs. Italy was eventually written into this agreement. Italy got parts of the Ottoman Empire, as we know, after the war, including at the Treaty of Sèvres. Italy mostly got the area kind of down near, from about Antalya over to Fethiye. Italy also had designs on Austrian territory, which became essentially the South Tyrol, which became a big issue at the Versailles Treaty. You're right, though, they were all problematic, because almost all of America's allies had designs on territory. The point I was making about which side would tend to favor it, again, so long as the Germans were winning, they didn't really like Wilson's idea, because they thought, after all, we're going to win the war and we're going to get all this territory. And they do give like one final throw of the dice. In March of 1918, just before, I think it's about the 21st, just before the kind of big mass of American troops start, arriving. They're just starting to arrive, but they haven't really reached the front yet. The Germans throw one last major offensive on the Western Front, the so-called Ludendorff offensive. And they do achieve breakthroughs. I mean, initially it was very successful. They used tanks, they used artillery very well. But as with all offensive in the First World War, eventually they exhausted themselves. Eventually it petered out. And to some extent, it disrupted the morale of the German armies. The American troops then start arriving. And as I said, eventually there are 4 million of them. 4 million troops. You talk about like a delicately poised balance of forces, right? For 4 years you have stalemate. Groups that are roughly equal in strength. And then America takes these 4 million men and they land them on one side. So that in a way, whatever they did was less important than the simple fact that they were there. it was like a signal to the Germans that unless they won the war immediately or made peace, they were going to lose. Which was, again, paradoxical because the Germans were winning on the Eastern Front. The Germans drew up a treaty at Brest-Litovsk, along with the Ottomans and the Austrians, essentially partitioning Russia. You know, just like the other allies wanted to partition the Ottoman Empire, they divided up Russia. Turkey got back the Elvi, Selassie, 3 provinces lost in the 1877 war, that is Batum, Ardahan, and Kars. So they got back this territory. Eventually they even got more in the Transcaucasus, although they quarreled with the Germans about the war aims in the Caucasus. The Germans got really most of Eastern Europe. I mean, they set up satellite states. Like Ukraine became sort of like a pseudo-independent German puppet. They got the Baltic states. You know, they had already occupied most of Poland. The Austrians just got little scraps here and there, and they got kind of a share in the basic settlement. So they basically carve up Russia. I mean, in a very serious way. Most of Russia's industry and a lot of its coal and iron were in the German-dominated regions. The Germans also demanded oil from Baku, which is one of the reasons they didn't want the Turks to have it, because the Russians had promised the Germans all of this oil. You know, so Germany basically wins the war in the East. They draw up a diktat peace completely counter to the principles of the 14 points, right? But then the Americans arrive on the Western Front. Germany begins to realize it's going to lose the war, not least because this was maybe their own fault. They had 1 million soldiers enforcing the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, basically occupying Russia, just as they're about to lose the war in the West. So then, you know, as the Germans, by like fall 1918, they start to realize they might lose. So then they suddenly become interested in the 14 points. And they say, hey, peace without annexations, that sounds great. Let's take it, you know, while we still can. And so they petition for an armistice along the lines that Wilson had drawn up. Confusion, as I have said. You know, you have cross purposes and all of these different currents in diplomacy. The Germans now think that they are going to be given a peace without annexations. They think that's what the Americans promised them, and they think that because America is now the key partner, the financier of the war, supplier of the weapons, supplier of the 4 million men that kind of made the difference, even though America didn't do that much actual fighting. It's not true they didn't fight. They lost about 200,000 men, but you know, that's compared to like 2 million for the Germans and 1.5 million for the French. They didn't do any of the decisive fighting, but the fact of their arrival is kind of what made the difference. So the Germans think, look, Wilson is like this all-powerful messiah now, right? I mean, he represents the richest country in the world with the largest economy, which is now the creditor, which is paying for the war. You know, all the debts are owed to the Americans. The Americans are building all of the weapons. They now have the largest army in Europe. And so the Germans think the Americans have offered us this deal, which we are going to get. This was the root, eventually, of a political catastrophe. The Germans, that is, thought they didn't really lose the war. They thought they were just kind of getting an armistice which the Americans had promised them, which would not punish them. Of course, the Americans and the British and the French all had very different policies. And eventually the Americans learned, well, they learned a lot of things. I mean, you always learn a lot of things when you're sort of new to a diplomatic arena. You know, amongst other things, that Wilson was not as smart as he thought he was, and that the British and French had a lot more experience with this sort of thing, and that they were not about to let America take away their victory, as they saw it. This was particularly true of the French. Again, it always helps to understand the different perspectives. Now, the Americans think, well, yeah, the Germans might have been somewhat to blame for the war, but look, we want a war where no one really gains too much. We want a balance of power. Because after all, America's far away. America's main interest is just ending the war and trying to create a settlement that will allow everyone to trade. Well, look at France. Most of the war on the Western Front had been fought on French soil. You know, French women had been raped in large numbers. You know, farms had been destroyed. Churches ransacked and turned into weapons arsenals. The land utterly devastated like a plague. Just, you know, scenes of biblical devastation everywhere. The French wanted what you would expect them to want. They wanted revenge. They wanted to punish the Germans and to make them pay. Britain was kind of like somewhere in between. You know, the British, they were now almost as anti-German as the French, but on the other hand, they also were concerned about trade, and so they don't want to punish Germany too badly because they want the country to emerge and, you know, help police the settlement. Also because they're beginning to worry about the Bolsheviks and communism might become a threat to the order of Europe, as we will see. So you have no real agreement between the powers. Oh yeah, and Italy again, to bring back the Italians. They're not as important as the other countries, but I mean, the Italians are sort of the worst of all. You know, they entered the war opportunistically against their own allies, right? They were supposedly allies of Germany and Austria-Hungary, and they said, well, no, now that you guys are fighting a war, you know, we want some territory. So the Italians wanted to gain basically part of Austria, and they wanted a part of Turkey, even though they did nothing to deserve that. So the Italians, they're like this thorn in the side of everything. They just screw everything up. Wilson's vision, that is, of a peace without annexations proves, of course, impossible to come up with in person. So when they actually meet at Versailles in 1919, all of the Allies, even though they are victorious, are at cross purposes. Not least because one of the key elements of the whole coalition, Russia, has stabbed everyone in the back by cutting a separate peace with the Germans. Which, if you remember from possibly, I don't know if I did mention last term, but way back in 1914 they had signed a convention in London where the three powers, Britain, France, and Russia, had promised not to make a separate peace. So you have secret treaties, hypocrisy exposed, double dealing, all of this making it virtually impossible for Wilson and the Americans to come and bring anything like the peace without annexations involving self-determination that they thought they had gone to war over. You had the recipe, that is, for a vast sort of diplomatic mess at Versailles. I think we're towards the end of the hour, I'm guessing. Okay, so we will end there today, and on Friday we will pick up with the Versailles Treaty and settlement.